Born on August 28, 1896, in the small town of Neosho, Nebraska, Andrew Jackson Higgins did not know luxury from childhood. His father, John Higgins, was a lumber dealer, and his mother, Anna, raised 4 children under constant financial strain. However, it was precisely this environment that formed in the future inventor an unrelenting hunger for independence and an unshakable belief that a person can create everything necessary with their own hands, as long as they are not afraid of hard work and not afraid of making mistakes. At the age of 17, barely out of school and having already lost his mother, Andrew took a job at a sawmill in Montana, and then, realizing that his calling was not to cut wood, but to turn it into something alive, moved to Louisiana, where the rivers and swamps required not just boats but smart, adaptive, almost sentient machines capable of penetrating the narrowest channels, settling on silt, and emerging from the water without assistance, which led him in 1922 to found his own company, Higgins Lumber and Export Company, which over time transformed into Higgins Industries, an enterprise that knew no compromise in matters of quality and functionality. Higgins was a man rough in communication, often quick-tempered, but invariably honest with workers and ruthlessly demanding when it came to details. And it was precisely this combination of traits, practicality, stubbornness, and intuitive understanding of mechanics, that allowed him to create not just a boat, but a survival tool that would later become the cornerstone of the entire Allied strategy in naval theaters of the war. The story of the Higgins Boat began not in a war ministry or a design bureau, but in the dense, humid thickets of the Mississippi Delta, where local hunters and loggers had struggled for decades with the inability of ordinary boats to enter shallow channels, and any attempt to land on a silty shore ended with the vessel getting stuck and requiring hours of manual pushing. It was this everyday problem that forced Higgins in the late 1920s to begin experimenting with flat-bottomed hulls, capable not only of gliding over coastal marshes, but also of crawling out of the water on their own, like a reptile returning to land. His first successful model, named Spoonbill for the resemblance of its bow to the beak of the bird of the same name, already possessed the features that would later form the basis of the legendary LCVP. A wide, stern-mounted propeller positioned underwater so it wouldn't snag on roots and grass, as well as a bow design allowing the boat to run aground and push off the bottom in reverse. But the true breakthrough came in 1937 when Higgins began working with a logging company harvesting timber on remote islands in the Delta, and he was faced with a challenge: to create a craft capable not only of delivering workers to the cutting site, but also of unloading them with their tools directly onto the shore, without docks or pontoons. This was when he developed the prototype known as the Eureka Boat, named after the Louisiana swamp region where the tests were conducted. And it was this prototype that first received a movable bow ramp operated manually via a system of cables and pulleys, allowing the vessel to instantly transform from a watercraft into a bridge between water and land. The boat was built from cypress, wood resistant to rot and salt water, and was tested under the harshest conditions: strong winds, tidal currents, silty bottoms where even swamp snakes lost traction. It not only endured, it exceeded all expectations, and it was this craft, created not for war but for loggers and hunters, that would one day attract the attention of someone Higgins could not have imagined at the time: a British military mission searching for salvation for its army at the brink of destruction. In 1940, when Europe plunged into the darkness of Nazi occupation, the British Admiralty, desperately searching for solutions for future amphibious operations, sent inquiries across the world, and one of these inquiries reached New Orleans. A representative of the British Royal Navy, Captain John Harrison, arrived at Higgins's factory, intending to inspect American landing prototypes, but instead saw a fisherman's boat with an unusual bow. Nevertheless, after witnessing a demonstration of the Eureka Boat on the Mississippi River, where the craft ran aground twice and pulled itself free twice within a single minute, Harrison was so astonished that he immediately sent a telegram to London recommending the start of negotiations. Higgins, for his part, did not initially grasp the seriousness of the situation. He believed it was a small order for a dozen boats to patrol the coastline. But when, in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States officially entered the war and the Pentagon announced a competition for the best landing craft, he realized the scale of the opportunity. His main competitor, the firm Andrew J. Beatty and Sons from New York, presented a massive, heavy design with an armored hull, but with a deep draft that made it useless on sandy beaches. Higgins, meanwhile, ignoring all bureaucratic formalities, simply brought his Eureka to the military trials in Norfolk, where, despite stormy seas and the skepticism of officers, his boat landed a group of Marines directly on the beach and then returned to open water within seconds. An act that so impressed the generals that the contract for producing the LCVP was signed even before the official end of testing. However, the path from prototype to mass-produced model was not easy. The military demanded modifications: steel instead of wood in the bow, reinforced engine protection, the ability to transport light vehicles, and standardized components to simplify field repairs. Higgins, instead of arguing, simply rebuilt the factory, implemented all changes in 3 months, and by the end of 1942 began supplying the Army with thousands of boats per month, each of which was inspected personally by him, and often assembled by his own hands during night shifts, when no one could see the multi-million-dollar company owner tightening the final bolts on the very ramp that would save lives on the other side of the world. The boat, officially designated as the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, LCVP, was something far more than just a means of transportation. It was a carefully engineered compromise between seaworthiness and shallow water mobility, between carrying capacity and maneuverability, between structural simplicity and battlefield reliability, and its success lay in the brilliant simplicity of solutions developed not in military engineering offices, but in the real-world swamps of Louisiana, where every detail mattered. The hull, originally wooden and later partially steel, measured 36 feet 3 inches in length and 10 feet 10 inches at its widest point. It was designed so that with a minimal draft, only 3 feet when fully loaded, it remained stable even in open water. The bow section, ending with a movable ramp made of thick steel weighing several hundred pounds, was operated either manually or hydraulically and could be lowered in less than 10 seconds after the craft touched the shore, allowing 36 fully equipped soldiers, each carrying a rifle, ammunition, backpack, and helmet, to leap out and surge forward under enemy fire with no delay whatsoever. The engine, initially a diesel and later replaced with the more reliable gasoline-powered Hall-Scott Defender, producing 250 horsepower, was placed in the stern, eliminating the need for a transmission and freeing the central space for infantry or light equipment. The speed reached 12 knots in calm water, and in rough conditions the boat still maintained maneuverability thanks to the special shape of its keel and low center of gravity. In addition, the boat was equipped with a special bilge system that allowed it to stay afloat even if the hull was damaged, and its flat bottom and lack of a forward rudder enabled the sand turn, a maneuver in which a grounded boat could push off the bottom and pivot in reverse without a tug, saving hundreds of lives during beach landings. Every bolt, every bracket, every seam in the Higgins boat was dictated not by aesthetics, but by necessity. The necessity of being fast, reliable, and unfailingly operational at the moment when not only a soldier's life but the outcome of an entire operation depended on it. If the Higgins boat could speak, it would tell stories not about itself, but about those who sat inside it, shaking from cold, fear, and adrenaline. And it is these voices, preserved in archives, diaries, and interviews, that form the living fabric of its legend. Sergeant Thomas Riley, an infantryman of the U.S. 1st Division, recalled, "When our Higgins boat approached Omaha, the water around us was already red with blood, and the sand was black with smoke. I was sitting across from a guy from Texas. He held a photo of his sister in his hands and kept repeating, 'I don't want to die in the water.' 3 minutes later, he was dead. A bullet to the chest before we even stepped out. But the boat kept going, even though it already had holes in it. And when I jumped, I felt like it pushed me forward, as if saying, 'Run while you can.'" Chief Boatswain's mate Harold King, who piloted the craft in Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, wrote in his diary, I saw Japanese shells tearing the water 2 meters from the bow. The wind ripped the screams from our throats, the waves flooded the deck, but the machine kept working. It didn't give up, just like we didn't. And General Omar Bradley, who observed the landing from the command ship, later stated, "If not for the Higgins boat, we would have lost Omaha in the first half hour. It was the boat that allowed us to hold the beachhead when everything seemed lost." These recollections, gathered decades later, do more than confirm the effectiveness of the design. They make it alive, almost human, because in every line you can hear gratitude not to the technology, but to the man who stood behind it. Before the Higgins boat appeared, attempts to create a universal landing craft had been made in many countries, yet all of them suffered from fatal flaws rooted in theoretical rather than practical design. The British landing craft Assault, for example, had a wooden hull covered with plywood and felt for camouflage. But its bow door opened far too slowly, and even in shallow water its draft was too deep, causing the craft to get stuck far from shore, forcing soldiers to wade the final stretch chest-deep under heavy enemy fire. The Japanese used wooden landing barges that caught fire easily after the first shell impact and offered no crew protection. The Germans, despite having powerful ports and coastal fortifications, developed almost no dedicated landing craft, relying instead on rail and ground logistics. The Soviet wartime industry could not afford mass production of specialized landing boats. Instead, ordinary barges and fishing vessels were used, making amphibious operations extremely risky. The Higgins boat, on the contrary, was created not in a vacuum of military theory, but in the real world, where every curve of the hull had been tested by the swamps, where every joint had been tested by wind and water. This practical origin, not a military specification, made it ideally suited for the extreme conditions of amphibious assaults. And even when competitors tried to copy its design, as the British did with their licensed LCVP, they could not reproduce the engineering intuition Higgins had put into every plank, every bolt, every inch of deck. When the war pulled millions of men away from factory floors, women took their place. And it was they who became the invisible engine of Higgins Industries. At the height of 1943, more than 20,000 people worked at Higgins's plants in New Orleans, over 60% of them women, many of whom had never held a hammer or a welding torch before, but within weeks learned not only how to assemble hulls, but also how to read blueprints, tune engines, and inspect weld seams. Higgins, unlike most of his industrial colleagues, not only allowed women to take on heavy jobs, but paid them the same wages as men, confident that labor is measured not by gender, but by the quality of work. These women, black and white, Catholic and Protestant from poor neighborhoods and rural backwaters, worked 10 to 12 hours a day, often without weekends, assembling 3 or 4 boats per day, each of which could save dozens of soldiers' lives. One of them, Margaret Wells, recalled, "We knew that every boat wasn't wood and steel. It was somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband. We didn't cry at work. We welded, cut, painted, prayed during lunch break, and went back to the machine." It was thanks to these women, who quietly endured exhaustion, discrimination, and fear for their loved ones on the front, that Higgins was able to do the impossible. Deliver more than 20,000 boats by the end of the war, his factories became not just production sites, but symbols of national unity and civilian heroism, often overlooked, but without which victory would have been impossible. The influence of the Higgins boat on the course of World War II cannot be measured merely by the number of units built or the number of soldiers it delivered. It lay in a fundamental rethinking of the very concept of amphibious warfare, in the transition from dreaming about landings to possessing a real, systematic, scalable ability to strike at the most unexpected places, where the enemy least anticipated resistance, and where traditional ports and coastal fortifications were useless. The first test of this new strategy came during Operation Torch in November 1942, when the Allies, seeking to open a second front in North Africa, needed to land more than 100,000 soldiers on the shores of Morocco and Algeria, areas where there was not a single port suitable for large ships, and where the coasts were littered with rocks, fishing boats, and minefields. It was the Higgins boat, in numbers exceeding 400 that ensured uninterrupted delivery of infantry, light artillery, and fuel directly onto the beaches, allowing British and American divisions not only to land, but to seize strategic points within the first 6 hours, completely derailing the German command's expectations of having a week to prepare the defense. In 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, Higgins boats again proved indispensable. They delivered 160,000 soldiers to 20 different beaches, including those where even Marines could not pass in armored carriers. Thanks to these craft, not the heavy landing ships, the Allies bypassed the main fortifications scattered along the northern coastline and captured Catania and Palermo without wasting time on prolonged sieges. However, the most dramatic and decisive demonstration of the Higgins boat's capabilities came during Operation Husky, the landing in Italy, where in September 1943, 180 boats leaving from Taranto delivered 120,000 men to the beaches near Salerno, even as German artillery batteries positioned on the heights shelled everything moving on the water. Many boats were torn apart by shells, but those that survived did not retreat. They kept going, returned for more troops, and it was this resilience, this ability of the boat to return to shore after multiple hits, that allowed the U.S. Fifth Army to hold the beachhead, even though the first 24 hours of the operation became some of the bloodiest in the entire Italian campaign. But none of these operations could compare in scale and significance to what happened on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when more than 5,000 landing craft, of which 1,500 were Higgins boats, crossed the English Channel in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying 156,000 soldiers, 20,000 tons of ammunition, and 4,000 vehicles. When these boats, like a swarm of steel fish, slammed into the shores of Normandy, they did more than deliver troops. They shattered the myth of the Atlantic Wall's impregnability. The German command, believing that a landing was possible only in ports, did not expect the Allies to land armies on beaches where the water was shallow and the sand soft, but where this boat, with its flat bottom and bow ramp, could run aground, unload, and leave. And it was this capability, created not in the war rooms but in the factories of New Orleans, that made possible what was once considered madness, a landing 30 kilometers from the nearest port, under fire, in a storm, in complete darkness. When the boats approached Omaha, where German batteries C-41 and WAN-62 fired from 30-meter heights, soldiers jumping from the boats could not see what awaited them. They saw only the door opening and the water pulling them downward. In that moment, when the body falls into the cold water and bullets whistle overhead, the boat standing behind them like an immovable guardian becomes the only point of support, not because it was armored, but because it did not leave, because its creator, Andrew Higgins, did not allow it to fail, even when everything around it was collapsing. It was thanks to this craft, not the heavy ships that could not get close to shore, that the Allies captured the beaches, broke through the defensive line, and began the liberation of Europe. Had it not been for the Higgins boat, had the Allies relied instead on slow, deep-draft, non-self-reversing vessels, the landing at Omaha likely would have ended in catastrophe, and Operation Overlord in failure, which could have prolonged the war for years and changed the map of the world. Moreover, the Higgins boat became the foundation for an entire system of amphibious operations. It enabled the development of the beach bridge concept, in which dozens of boats working on schedule like clockwork delivered troops, ammunition, and medical supplies without pause, even as night fell. It was this system, built on simplicity, reliability, and mass production, that became the key to victory not only in Europe but also in the Pacific, where in the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, amid Japanese fortifications dotted with tanks and mines, the Higgins boat once again delivered soldiers to shores where tanks could not pass, where only infantry could fight, and where this craft, with its ability to ground itself and push back out to sea, saved thousands of lives that otherwise would have been lost in water, in fire, in emptiness, abandoned without support. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the world seemingly no longer needed landing craft, and Higgins Industries, having lost its primary customer, rapidly reduced production. But the technology born in the swamps of Louisiana continued to live on, first in the military conflicts of the following decades, then in peaceful missions of rescue and aid. In the Korean War, LCVPs were used for the landings at Incheon, where their ability to operate in shallow waters played a decisive role in bypassing North Korean fortifications. In Vietnam, modified versions of the Higgins Boat were employed as patrol craft along the Mekong River, where their maneuverability and ease of repair made them indispensable in the jungle environment. Yet the most touching continuation of their story is connected with civilian missions. During Hurricane Katrina in 2005, several restored Higgins boats took part in evacuating residents of New Orleans from flooded areas, as if returning to their origins, rescuing people where ordinary vessels could not pass. Today, surviving examples can be seen in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, in the Omaha Beach Museum in France, in the Imperial War Museum in London, and on the museum ship USS LCIL 713 in California, where each of them is not just an exhibit, but a memorial, not only to that era, but to the spirit of ingenuity, resilience, and service to others embodied in a man named Andrew Higgins. His name does not adorn marble monuments in Washington, but it is engraved in the memory of millions. For without his boat, without that modest, unremarkable craft with a folding door, the Normandy landing might have failed. The war might have dragged on for years, and millions of lives might never have been born. And so when today we speak of the heroes of World War II, we should remember not only those who held rifles, but also those who created what allowed those rifles to reach the shore. Andrew Higgins died on August 30th, 1952, on his 56th birthday, of lung cancer, leaving behind not wealth, not a palace, not a monument, but only a workshop in New Orleans, several hundred workers who continued building boats for fishermen, and tens of thousands of people whose lives he saved without ever knowing their names. He never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews, never appeared on screens, never asked for awards, and when told he had saved the war, he simply answered, "I just did what I knew how to do." He was not a man who sought greatness. He was a man who simply did what was necessary. And in this lies his greatness. He did not think about glory. He thought about ensuring the boat wouldn't get stuck, that the door wouldn't break, that a soldier wouldn't drown because he, Andrew, hadn't done his job as well as it could be done. And when today, in 2025, we look at a world full of technologies that make life more convenient but do not save it, we should remember, greatness is not in being the first but in being the last who didn't give up, not in creating something grand but in creating something necessary, not in being a hero, but in being the person who, standing in a workshop with a hammer in hand, knows that every part he tightens is not metal, not wood, not a bolt. It is a life that has not yet begun, but that can begin if only the boat does not sink, if only the door does not jam, if only someone does not forget that even the simplest thing can change the world. Andrew Higgins did not forget. He did not want to be a hero, but the world made him one, not for words, not for medals, but for what he did.